Pixel Sift.
Hi, my name's Gianni, and welcome to episode 154 of Pixel Sift. Now, Naftali, or Tali Faulkner, is from Umurangi Generation, and a Maori game developer who lives in regional New South Wales and has made the neon photographic game Umurangi Generation. Tali and I had this conversation a few months ago when the game had first been released in the context of the early days of COVID-19 in Australia, and coming off the back of some of the worst bushfires that Australia had ever seen. Umurangi Generation has been selected as part of the PAX EGX Left Field collection, which is part of the reason why we decided to put this episode out this weekend, and you can find a demo of the game in the show notes of this episode. We'll talk about some of the personal experience that went into making this game, building upon layers of context into a story that's about the people who will bear witness to the end of the world. Australia's best video game podcast.
Subscribe to Pixel Sift on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever podcasts are found.
And now, can you tell me a little bit about your game for people who may not have come across it? Just explain what it is. How do you play it? What sort of style of game is it?
So, Umurangi Generation is a semi-realistic photography game set in a, I'll say, retro future. But yeah, the idea with it is it's a game where you sort of take photos, but it's not really like a lot of games. It's kind of like photography slapped onto something else, like photography slapped onto, being a detective, or, Pokemon Snap, where it's like photography slapped onto sort of the nature vibe of it. The idea with Umurangi Generation was to sort of make a photography game where like the actual act of photography itself is like accurately portrayed, and like sort of designing it around like a sort of set of assumptions that like wouldn't really lead players down sort of bad photography habits and things like that. It's sort of like, one of the things when designing this game, it was kind of like, you really can't tell people what is or isn't creative or punish creativity, because the moment you do that, you're essentially going to start conditioning players into sort of, the game, or the electronic piece of software that has rules and exceptions built into it, is going to start trying to tell humans what is or isn't creative or human. And like, so part of that was that like when designing this, you're graded on color, content, and composition, rather than like sort of other games where it's about framing stuff centered and getting a really like objective structure around the photos. So like players have a lot of, I guess, options and freedom to sort of take the photos however they want. And I think part of that is because it's just sort of like, if you've ever followed like art discourse, it's sort of the idea that, there's no really objectively good art. It's all subjective, and from just a like, human sense, who the hell is going to, let a computer tell them what is or isn't good when they feel an emotion to something? So
as part of that, though, there are photographs that are better in terms of money, even though the money sort of doesn't really mean anything. So there is sort of a reward system, or sort of pointing towards a sort of direction. How did you sort of want to frame that so that there are photos that are better, but not photos that are worthless, if that kind of makes sense?
So the interesting thing about the money is that actually came from part of the design that I actually took out. Originally, this game was actually going to be a little bit more cruel, because it was going to be about what it's like to get by as a starving artist. The idea was you would take all these photos and earn all this money, and then at the end of every level, rent, electricity, all this stuff would just come out and just suck your paycheck away. And I wanted, it was that idea of getting players to feel like, oh shit, yeah, this is kind of what it's like to, have this creative thing and really enjoy it, and then, get slapped in the face with, crippling debt, I guess. But I ended up sort of taking that out because I think after a while it just kind of didn't really fit with sort of the tone, if that makes sense. Like, I think there is definitely room to explore that in a game in the future. I might not be the one to make it, but I think, games are really good at making players experience things which they might not experience in their actual, lives. So, when you start to feel an emotional connection to, like, say, this game's sort of later content, which I've seen a lot of people connect with really strongly, I think it's, a lot of room to explore in that space. So, like, yeah, that was sort of the original idea around it. And, like, I kept it in and I tried to sort of dial it back in a way where, yeah, it's not really that consequential. It more just now is linked to, one of the optional bonus objectives, so that, players who are really, fixed on the world and fixed on the gameplay itself have something to sort of do during, like, a second run. Because I think with this game, not to toot my own horn or anything, I think it's that idea that, a second run, there's a lot of stuff you'll miss the first time through, but you'll probably want to clue yourself into because of, what happens obviously towards the end. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a weird balance, I think, between, we talk about art, like games as art and, games as product. And it's sort of like when we're talking about games as art, why should you have to put in, like a timer or a bunch of sort of gamey objectives? Why can't it just be a experience where you just sit and shoot? And I guess the sad reality is that, like, I want this game to sort of reach certain people who might not really be receptive to a message if it is just a really experimental thing where there's not really a gameplay system tied to it. Because I guess the reality is, like, a lot of gaming is just it's very like a one channel kind of experience. A lot of the discourse around it ends up being tied to things like frame rate and performance, or sort of objective design decisions. Like, if a game has smooth gameplay versus a game that has clunky gameplay, well, if the clunky gameplay was intentional, is that still the same critique? Yeah.
One of the things I did sort of notice is that a lot of the game has a very light touch, I would sort of describe it as, and it reminds me of a lot of games I've played at sort of installation spaces where, anyone can kind of jump in and do that sort of thing. But there are obviously those little bits and pieces in it that make it a bit more gamey. Can you tell me a little bit about how you sort of found that balance that made sure it felt right for you to sort of tell the story that you wanted to tell without it being too much of a make sure you get through this level within X and get Y number of bonuses?
Well, I guess just to start with, so I think the thing about it is it's kind of like you're in a pretty interesting space when you sort of have a game all about taking photos, because if you're telling people, I need you to take this, vague description of a photo, where you say to players, can you take a photo of 7 birds? And it's up to you how you want to do that. Essentially, you're getting them to look at something, and they get to choose how they look at it, obviously. But I think it becomes one of those things where, like, with this game, with the photo bounties that are in the game, the idea is that, like, there's a mix of, like, puzzle-based ones and the sort of, like, Where's Wally, pixel hunting stuff. But then there's also, the ones that are explicitly there to clue players into sort of the story and things like that, The reality is, like, when it does take that shift midway through the game, I want players to at least have, like, I want players to sort of absorb the story through, obviously the environment and things like that. And I think, part of having the camera where you actually have to look and search around for things and pixel hunt and stuff like that, it means you have, like, an incredible opportunity to sort of get players looking at things that they probably would have run past otherwise. One of the things which I think was unintentional in this game, but thinking about it, is, like, this game doesn't have a run or a sprint button, right? But, the more I think about that now, this is post-release, I didn't plan this or anything. It's like, would players have actually just run past most of the, world building and storytelling if they had that option to just, sprint past and play it more like a, fast paced game?
That is the thing, because it's in a way, it's kind of a first person shooter, isn't it? Instead of shooting bullets, you're shooting pictures. It's kind of interesting to me you sort of mentioned that there are those elements there. And I know that when I was playing the game, the muscle memory made me want to press shift to kind of move around, especially in those last little elements when I was looking for, a single word on the side of a car that it took me a long time to find, and all of those sort of things. I'm just like, I've been here. I just want to race up here and just have a look at those sort of things. Sort of pairing stuff back. Did you get sort of feedback from people saying that they really wanted that, and how much of that did you say, look, part of the experience is not having those things?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough thing, and I'm not a parent yet, but I can imagine, it's that whole thing of, is it for the player's own good, to run it through sort of things like this? For me, one of the communities I was really involved with at the beginning of its sort of inception was the Dark Souls community. Like Vardy Video, who's one of the biggest uploaders on that stuff, did all the lore videos and that, which everyone, consumed really, I guess, like religiously. That's not a throwing shade his way or anything. But, one of the things with those games is that, like, there is that sort of attention to detail in, the environmental storytelling and whatnot, where having a certain item placed somewhere tells a story that, some players might gloss over. It was really about, I guess, striking a balance, because like whilst the game does have all the storytelling and stuff, for me, I wasn't too worried if players didn't necessarily pick that up before the midway point. Once you reach that midway point, you have to pay attention, and there's a lot of things where you might have actually just like absorbed it, in the back of your mind, like, oh, what's going on there, and not been aware of any of that. But once it hits you, you kind of connect all the dots, and you go, oh, I understand now. And that's what I mean about, like, people probably want to go through a second time, because one of the things I tried to do with this game was make it that everything, like, on the walls and like posters and stuff like that, it is related, but it's never explicit in the sense of, like, I'll use a like really vague example here, so we're avoiding spoilers and stuff. There's a there's a poster, I think, for I'm just trying to pick which one, because I don't want to sort of like give the cheese away here, I guess. It's sort of like that idea that, like, I think there's one where it's just like, hey, you can soundproof your home. Call this number. Now, why would someone want to soundproof their home? It's not saying why. Like, it's not explaining, like how we live in the moment, where, how ads at the moment, and even before with the bushfires, it was that whole thing of, let's not actually talk about the problem here. Let's talk as much around it as we can to keep people comfortable with sort of where they're living at this point. So, like, we're seeing...
So maybe a clever tweak could have been, we're all in this together. Why not soundproof your home?
Yeah. Or for example, I saw one the other day when I was... I listen to YouTube as I drive, because I don't really listen to the radio. So, you get those ads that pop up every, they're really repetitive, and it's things like, now's more important than ever to stay together. And then, so you should buy 25 gigs of data through Telstra, and, we'll get this, all get through this together. And it's that really, I think, cynical thing where, like, for me, this game for me was about exploring, like, a type of neoliberalism where it's kind of that idea that, like, if you make people comfortable while you have like a boot on their neck, or, they're facing, a crisis event, they're going to eventually become comfortable. We're seeing this with COVID. We saw it definitely with the bushfires, which, that's what this game takes its main inspiration from. I don't know if you found the newspaper that says the Prime Minister took a holiday to Rarotonga, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's like, for me, like, it's all intentional. It's just like one of those things where, how much of that do you want to give away, to begin with? Like, I think with a lot of world building in video games, there's this habit to sort of try and spell it all out in the first 5 minutes, like, for example, imagine any game, and like, you're going to the new area, and you've got, an NPC companion with you, and they say, this is where we do the, thing with the really important plot device, and we're going to have to, and it just, for me, I think, just, I'm sick of it. Like, I think the best way to sort of tell those stories is to really take a step back and let the player sort of, like, either come to their own conclusion, or, like, I don't know, just like it's okay if they miss it.
Well, I mean, what I sort of noticed when I was playing through is it really felt like it was there's sort of layers of context in there. You know, there was parts that I sort of understood from playing through the game and seeing a lot of things like a lot of the Japanese anime. I saw references in there that really look like things like Neon Genesis Evangelion.
Yep.
And there's bits that I sort of understand in Australian. There's bits that I sort of understood with people who in my family who come from New Zealand. But there was also bits that I didn't always have all the context of some of the Maori context that are sort of included in that. But I imagine for people who are playing this game, when they come to it, they're picking up bits and pieces. Can you tell me how you sort of built up that layer, and particularly talk to me a little bit more about putting some of your Maori heritage into this game?
Yeah. So I guess for me, it is like layering was one of the things that I did because the whole idea around it is like. The first layer, it's that, direct, as you're saying, the anime comparison and stuff like that, which players who don't want to invest with, the message of, it being a kind of a mirror to the bushfires and things like that, they can ignore that, right? And then I think there is also that deeper layer that I did write in, which, it's a Maori layer, if that makes sense, where, like there's a lot of imagery in there, which streamers and that watching it, they've like unintentionally said things like, oh, wow, this place is getting invaded. What's going on there, And for me, Naitarangi, and the game takes place where I'm from. It was about sort of putting certain elements of like, my family story into the like world itself, just not in a way where it was, like it was the similar event, but it wasn't like, there's that bit midway where, the soldiers are injured, right? For me, I know my family history. What happened with that was that at the Battle of Gate Pa, which was where not just Maori, but, Pakeha or white people who had come to Tauranga and like, hooked up. Like we weren't like this exclusive, standoffy people. If you wanted to live here, like, you'd live here, but you wouldn't try and step on us kind of thing. So what happened at Gate Pa was that like, it was this battle and I found a journal or a newspaper, from Auckland or something, and it says, the British Army suffered their worst defeat ever against a army of half-naked savages. The thing about that battle with these supposed half-naked savages is the British soldiers who were left behind, were all nursed back to health and sent on their way. And so, like, this idea in this game is that the UN forces who are in this world, they are stepping on the necks of people, but it's not really their fault. Like, it's the system that's put them there in the first place, Like, I think a lot of players are pretty receptive to the, when they go to those spaces, the UN spaces, they can see that those UN soldiers aren't exactly happy to be there, and they're not exactly, like, thrilled about how it's all being handled. And so, stuff like that, where I didn't want to necessarily, like, there are things about colonization. Reality is that's something that we deal with every day, the flow-on effects from that. Part of, like, this game is that, I wanted to make a game that Maori could, play as well. And part of that is that, we have conversations that have extended far beyond the sort of surface level stuff about was it right or wrong? Because, the reality is that times kept moving forward and our culture's not static. There's a band called the Patia Maori Club, which if you've ever seen Taika Waititi's earlier movie, Boy, at the end he does, the thriller haka, and it's that song. And, the most awesome thing about that is that was made in the 80s. And it's this song with, a lot of traditional dance, a little like the poi and things like that, and it's got song, but it's also got a synth, and it's about taking that culture and showing that we can rock it in the real, like in the not the real world, the modern, you know what I mean? Like it's not just all about taiaha.
Everything comes from everything else, isn't it? Like every moment is influenced by what's come before. From a lot of different places. One thing you sort of touched on earlier, you was talking about how much you loved the sort of the lore videos of Dark Souls and sort of digging into that, and it became a big thing. Now, would you be hoping that somebody might go through and I guess dig through the cultural context, the historical context, and maybe do like a breakdown video for your game?
Oh, yeah, well, I can definitely imagine it. I don't know if anyone would. I think it's one of those things where like the initial Dark Souls community was very small and very like passionate, and the lore video stuff really came from I think a lot of forum and the community trying to work it out and whatnot. And I think there is a bit of that community starting at the moment with like a lot of those players are coming together and like they're sharing their photos, because that's a big part of the game in the terms like it's not explicit in the game, but does say at the end, hey, good job, here's your photos, take a look. And I think, once players actually revisit what they took, they get a sense of pride of what happened. And so, like, I think when players start to piece together the lore, they got all the tools to do that. They got, a camera and all this stuff where, like, the story itself is there. And like, one of the greatest things I think at the moment is that, I'm seeing people finish the game and they're having their own interpretation that sort of connects to themselves. So, there is the story, I think, of, this thing coming to, Tauranga and, really like doing a lot of damage, but also, how's the government handling it and everything like that. But then I think there's also the thing where, like, I had a Brazilian journalist contact me and they just finished it. And they said, this really jumped out to me because of how, Brazil's handling COVID and also the bushfires that happened over there. So I think it's one of those things where, when I think about that, it's, I don't really know how to go further into that, I guess.
Well, yeah, it's kind of that thing where everyone sort of brings their own context to the interpretation of art, isn't it?
Yeah.
And, maybe as we kind of progressed through, there's, I mean, I'm sure when you were making the game, you weren't factoring in the fact that we'd have a global pandemic as part of this sort of cycle. But a lot of the context in that, even just the people where you have to take a photo of a couple, like a parent and a child, it looks like, and they're wearing face masks at the time. And I'm like, wow, that really feels like it was just a moment that happened to be in the game.
About all that was that, like, when these bushfires happened, my mum's house got completely destroyed, like completely destroyed, like just flattened and so I've seen what it's like behind the tape, if that makes sense, because I went there and videoed and took photos and stuff like that, because I was like, well, one of the things about that was that when you go there, it is an experience where, okay, you're driving out and you get to a checkpoint and the people let you through, and then you start to see this just really weird, surreal, like, here's a road and one half of it's just completely like torched trees, nothing gone, and the other half's totally fine. And then you go out to this base and, this house we had, that was an old house. And, there was a thing where there was asbestos suspected. And I don't know if that was suspected asbestos that was from the house or from other houses that had burned down. But, what ended up happening there was you had to bring out a mask because you didn't want to breathe that in. It was really surreal because, like, what we did is we went out one day and just saw it for what it is, like, I can send you some of these photos. It looked like, those photos you'd see of hills in Vietnam after the Americans had just bombed the shit out of them, just completely flat, like moon dust and then sticks, just like that. And then we revisited that space the next day. So stuff like that, I think that really played into not just like the shocking imagery, but also like, we all know famously how ScoMo handled this, and not getting into ScoMo, but he's more or less just a symptom of a larger issue. ScoMo might be gone in 6 months, but I don't think we're going to not see the same thing happen over and over again, where it ends up being that the only reason people start caring about the bushfires is because they're getting close to North Shore Sydney.
So ultimately, do you think this is a hopeful game, or do you think it's a game that kind of is taking stock of the place where we are right now?
So the game's called Umurangi Generation, and that's roughly translates to red sky generation, or like, that's the kind of red you might see in an oven, or, in that sunset that you'd see, as the sun goes down and whatnot. And I chose that name because it's about this idea of the Umurangi generation are the last generation who have to watch this shit happen again. It could be climate change, like fires. It could be floods. It could be anything. It's like this idea that, we know this is coming. The sort of older generation aren't doing anything about it. Yeah, for me, I guess it's like, this Umurangi generation could be the generation coming through at the moment, like the one's a bit younger than millennials. We've got the science in at the moment on this climate change stuff, and people are saying about 10 years from now it's going to be pretty bad. But it could be in the future. Like I know for a fact that, like, I as a millennial who think a lot of this stuff, I see people in my same age demographic, and they're totally willing to jump onto the whole mindset that's put us here in the first place. One of the things I think about a lot is like there was this guy I met at a conference a couple of years ago, a Native American guy, and he sort of said everyone wants to go back to their traditional ways, but it's those traditional ways that got us in this mess in the first place. You know, a lot of those sort of, I guess, far right groups, you know, they're schooling up a lot of these young people at the moment into taking their place once they go. So I don't necessarily think that the Umurangi generation are, you know, millennials or anything. I think it's more that idea. It's the people who have to sit in a space where, you know, they can't do anything about it.
For people who are going to play this game, what's the thing that you would sort of encourage them to do or not do before they come into it?
So first thing, it's a game where you can just chill out. You don't have to do the bonus objectives. Just take your time. Go at your own pace. If you don't want to, you know, solve an objective or, you know, you're finding it hard, you can probably Google the answer. I think a lot of people, they're really liking the, you know, aha moment of, you know, the Where's Wally type gameplay where it is, you know, I Spy books where, you know, the fun is finding it yourself. If you're not like enjoying it, don't feel bad. I mean, the idea is that like the fun in the game really, I think, comes from taking the photos yourself and then also, you know, sort of exploring around that space. So I know that, like, for me, it's one of those things where I'm kind of like, the coin is just currently up in the air flipping because I don't know if it's really the thing of some people are kind of going sort of like gamer brain lizard mode, if that makes sense, where they're sort of like, they are approaching it sort of like a normal game, but the game really doesn't punish you for that. So don't be too hard on yourself, I guess.
Do you think there is, I guess, a sort of a tension that already sits there just because of the way that you've sort of delivered this medium? Because people are starting to understand that games can be used to deliver a sort of different context and different sort of ideas, but there is still that idea that if you get in this game, a lot of people do it because they want to get in and get out, and maybe they want to finish the whole game in 7 minutes.
Yes.
You know, like, how does that sort of tension sit with you?
So something I think when you asked that question, it made me think about was like, you know, the reality is at the moment we're living in a space where I think gaming is quite right-wing, if that makes sense. And I think if you have a game that has, you know, I think a message that does parallel climate change or whatever, you're going to have people get upset. Now, should you cater to those people? I don't think so. They'd never cater to me. And so the thing I think about is that, like, you know, if I'm going to tackle this stuff, I'm going to punch hard. And I think, like, you know, for me, you know, the game obviously has non-white people in it, which it's weird to have to try and talk around that in some spaces, you know. That's seen as a virtue signal or, you know, identity politics. But the reality is that we exist. And, you know, there's LGBT people in the game and whatnot. And I think the idea is if you punch hard enough, they can't just, you know, latch on to one thing. They've got to actually absorb the content as a whole. And so, you know, for me, it was, you know, the reality is, like, fascists are going to always exist. There's a paper called Fascism by Umberto Eco, and he talks about, like, your 20th century fascists, you know, who might have your armbands and, you know, militaristic stuff. They can abandon all that and they can move on to something else, but they'll still have that family resemblance. He kind of talks about the fact that, like, you know, like we're seeing it today, you know, like you sort of fascists at the moment, they don't parade the street. They get a nice haircut and wear a suit and, you know what I mean? Like, wear a nice blazer and got the white collar turtleneck and all that, and you get
the uniform is interchangeable. It's the ideology behind it.
Yeah, and it's like there's a guy called Christian, I can't remember his last name, it's like Piccanini or something, and he sort of was a neo-Nazi, and he was the guy who came up with the idea of softening that message. And so for me, like, I got a Steam review, and it was obviously one of those guys pretending to be Aboriginal, because you could tell, like, just reading his message, that if you call yourself like a black, you're probably not, you know, like it's pretty obvious. You know, it's one of those things where, like, I think those fascists are out there, you know, existing in this space as an Indigenous person. They're going to attack me anyway. So, like, I'll just punch hard. You know what I mean?
might as well make some art, and then you might bring some people along on the way.
Yeah, and like, you know, the other thing is, like, you know, it's weird I have to even think about that, but, like, that's the reality of, you know, where we're in at the moment. You know, we have seen that rise in fascism over the last, like, 10 years, and it's become pretty, like, blinding, I think, because, like, I still think we're kind of in that space where a lot of people, they still aren't even aware that these guys are, like, they have softened their message, or that they have, you know, infiltrated a lot of discourse. And it's usually with that idea of, oh, doesn't it feel bad that they want to, you know, erase you? But it's never been the case. It's just been that everyone gets a go. But anyway.
To me, as someone who's been playing games for a long time, since sort of the, you know, early or late 90s, people sort of seem like they're only just cluing onto online conversation in a way that I have already heard for many, many years. And people go, games are not radicalizing, and of course there are artworks in there, but you always have come across those people as well who are those sort of, their personal identity is just in reacting and attacking other people.
I mean, the reality is, like, that Steam review I'm talking about earlier said that this game was identity politics, and then literally the next sentence later said, I am, a black and I am offended, and doing the exact same thing you're accusing them.
No, but I just think it's interesting because, I mean, there are other ways. Like, you could have potentially have made a film, right, where there is an audience that seems to be a little bit more, I guess, more receptive into. I mean, the New Zealand filmmaking scene and the Australian filmmaking scene is really great at this sort of stuff. And you mentioned Taika Waititi as well, and like all of the films that he's done.
Yeah.
But a game is a more challenging space. Was that important for you to do that?
I think, one of the things which I think about a lot with stuff like that is one of the things about games media is that it's very much a millennial entertainment source. Like, even Gen X, who are younger Gen X, even they're kind of still like, nah, whatever, I don't care. Like, it's just a toy or something. Whereas I think like games at the moment very much are sort of like, we grew up during that shift, like where it went from, the sort of just platformer toy type thing to, even just like a few years ago, we're getting pretty like cool stuff like, Senwa's Sacrifice, where the reality is that mental health is on the rise, and this game in some way talked about that. And so, the thing I think about is that games as a medium is growing at the moment into a really interesting space, There was a paper I saw a couple years ago, and it was this idea of like, you have like Quigg, which is like, Tetris and Pac-Man and that. And then you have like, games as a work of art. And, I think it's that whole thing where, it's just like with film, right? You've got, your Oscar bait, type artsy movies, but then you've also got, your dumb schlock that is unapologetically dumb schlock that you consume. And, for me, it's that idea that like, I'd like to see like myself in this industry kind of as like, someone who can help bring that forward, because I feel like for me, I've got a couple of ideas that I think would work really well, and I don't really think you could do them in a film, because the difference between like a film and a game is like, in a game, you're an active participant, and, that's what this game sort of like, I think connects with a lot of people on, is that, by the end, you're actually kind of like connected to the people you're around. Anyone listening to this and you're kind of wanting to see more Indigenous game designers, like for me, I'm kind of in a bit of a fraught space. I'm a Maori person working in Australia, making Indigenous games, which there's a little bit of stuff around there. But, we are starting to see Aboriginal designers come through too. But the person I'd recommend you follow, who's really passionate and really good at promoting and really getting the stuff on your eyes, like in your radar, is I can't really say her last name, but she's a reporter, and she's often always connecting people up with this stuff, getting it in their eyeballs and things like that. And I'm part of Indigenous game design groups, and it's really obvious that the stuff that's coming out of there is really fresh and new. And something I think we're all in agreement of is that when we make these games, we're not making like a tourist experience. We're not going to make some game where it's, really even entertaining the sort of stereotypes and things like that. We might critique them, but for me as a Maori person, if you want the like touristy version of what it means to be Maori, I don't think Umurangi Generation's the place where you're really going to find it.
That's Tali Faulkner talking about Umurangi Generation, selected as part of the PAX EGX Left Field collection. Our conversation, we had it a few months ago in the early days of COVID-19 and when the game had just been released, but it's a real pleasure to be able to share that with you now. Coming up, we will be bringing you some PAX Online content as well, so keep an eye on our website, on our social media. We're going to talk to some of the other titles that have been selected, which were made in Australia as part of the PAX showcase. So keep an eye out on that. And of course, you can find information about all the stuff we've talked about, including a link to the demo, which is available now, of Umurangi Generation on the show notes of this episode and on our website. Our website is pixelsift.com.au. If you like the show, you can share it with a friend. That'll really help us out. Tell people who you think might enjoy this and get them to check out the show. If you want to be part of the conversation with us, share the work that you're doing. Join us in our really vibrant Discord server that we've got going on, where people are sharing their work all the time. And if you want to get an idea of what it's like to do something creative, or you want to get some inspiration from other people who are doing great work, that's a great place for you to go. That is pixelsift.com.au/Discord, where you can join up there. That's all for now. Until next time, have fun.